ICN started back in 1984 in Victoria, and the reason we started was to give small businesses an opportunity to link up with projects. Very soon, we spread across the country and onto New Zealand as well. The reason for our success? The reputation that we have built over the years with project owners. Don't forget that we have a very committed and skilled team of consultants across the country working in our local ICN offices. They verify the small businesses that they work with and link them up with the projects. There are no restrictions when it comes to the project side of things. We can work with anyone locally, regionally, and even globally. However, if you happen to be a small business, you need to be registered in Australia or New Zealand.
Hello and welcome back to the Unlocking Digital Horizons 2024. My name is Mike and this is Louise.
Hello.
And we have been here since this morning, keeping the wheels turning. And on that note, we have got another presentation that's going to be given to us by the Guild Group. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the Managing Director of Guild R&D Incentives and Grants. That will be Renee Levings. A bit of a short bio. After over 15 years as an R&D incentives and government grants specialist working for a global Big Four professional services firm, Renee now leads a highly experienced team at Guild Group to assist companies assess and defend much needed funding through government incentives. So I think it's very pertinent to what we are discussing today. Prior to life as a professional R&D advisor, Renee obtained her PhD and had a successful scientific research career in biotechnology and bioinformatics, and holds an MBA in innovation and leadership. Renee has advised national and global corporations in the energy, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, pharmaceutical, agtech, mining, resources, food and beverage, manufacturing, infrastructure, and ICT industries. As part of her role at Guild, Renee helps companies simplify complex reporting processes and navigate government regulatory frameworks, allowing them to assess government grants and incentives. Also joining us today and going to be talking alongside Renee is Alex Canning, who is the manager of the Guild Group R&D Incentives and Grants. Alex Canning leverages his robust background in law and pharmaceutical sciences with over 5 years of dedicated experience in the Australian R&D tax incentive, with a special focus on emerging sectors such as biotechnology, agriculture, advanced manufacturing, and computer science. His proficiency encompasses strategic project management, documentation, and governance processes, then implementation of process automation to optimize R&D claims, ensuring meticulous compliance with complex legislative frameworks. Known for his leadership in navigating the intricate processes of Oz industry and ATO audits, Alex has a proven track record in securing favorable outcomes, something every SME wants to hear. His expertise, that's just my improvisation of that, by the way, his expertise extends to the strategic preparation and management of advanced and overseas finding applications, crucial for companies looking to extend their R&D efforts internationally. Alex's deep understanding of the R&D tax incentive framework allows him to deliver customized advice, aligning with the unique challenges and opportunities of both emerging startups and established enterprises. Alex employs a forward-thinking and results-driven approach that not only maximizes entitlements, but also empowers companies to fully leverage their innovation potential. His strategic insights and dedication to client success foster a culture of innovation and continuous improvement. Please join me in introducing you to Alex and Renee.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Mike and Lisa, for facilitating the event, and also for that very lengthy introduction there. That's probably our fault. Yeah, as suggested by the title of our session today, Alex and I are here to share with you some insights into opportunities for government funding as you or your clients embark on transformation projects. So next slide. So most of you, I'm sure, are aware of the importance of innovation in any transformation journey. Innovation as a core component of transformation is known to fuel competitiveness, drive efficiencies and productivity, improve customer satisfaction and customer experiences, and it also ensure adaptability, resilience, and responsiveness in an ever-changing global economy. Next slide, please. So here we've just got some stats. I probably don't need to sort of run through them all, but you'll definitely see the benefits of ensuring that innovation is integral to any sort of transformation journey that you're on. So yeah, so there's just some stats on that. So if we could move to next slide, thanks. We understand though that innovation is expensive. So identifying funding sources for your innovation is key and requires careful considerations of the options that you have available to you. That choice of funding really depends on the stage of the company, the amount of capital that's required, the strategic goals of the project, as well as the company. Interestingly, in Australia, 60% of funding comes from internal sources, so that's things around revenue, companies' own sort of profits, and 20% of funding comes from government grants and subsidies. So it's a fairly significant sort of portion of those sort of grants that are sort of fueling innovation here in Australia. There's some other sources down the bottom there, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and we won't go into any detail, but yeah, definitely government grants and subsidies are something that should be considered. Next slide, please. So our focus today is really going to be running you through, just at a high level, some of the R&D, well, obviously the R&D tax incentive and some information about grants, really talking to some of the benefits that are available, running you through key eligibility criteria. Next slide, I think, as well as identifying and sort of pointing in the direction of eligible activities, eligible expenditure, and Alex is going to run you through some case studies and examples. So, and at the end, obviously, like all other sessions today, we'll have a Q&A to sort of answer any questions that you might have. Next slide. In Australia, the flagship program really for funding research and innovation is the R&D tax incentive. I'm sure some of you, most of you may be familiar with that, but it's industry agnostic, and it was really designed to incentivize activities that would make Australia globally competitive. So basically make us a smarter nation. And it's been around in some form since about 1986. In the latest reporting period, which was for the 22 income year, there are over 12,000 registrations, and 88% of those registrations were submitted by small to medium-sized enterprises, and basically resulted in $15 billion of registered R&D expenditure to which the benefit was going to be claimed. So we've just got some basically sort of purpose bubbles there, just in terms of what the research and development tax incentive was designed to do. Next slide. Applying for the R&D tax incentive is an annual process. So basically companies have to go through a process of assessing their activities and submit their application on an annual basis. Companies have until 10 months after their year end to lodge that application. It's a funny program because it's one of the only programs I think that's duly administrated by the ATO and AusIndustry. So AusIndustry will look at your technical activities, and they'll sort of assess those against the legislative criteria as an eligible R&D activity. And the tax office will look at the eligible expenditure and really see how that expenditure relates to those activities. So now I'm just going to pass over to Alex, and Alex is going to run basically probably what you're all wanting to hear is the benefit levels, some key sort of eligibility criteria that you need to be aware of, and run you through some case studies that might be relevant for your industry.
Thanks, Renee. Next slide, please. So the R&D tax incentive falls into two categories. Companies are either eligible for a refundable or a non-refundable tax offset, dependent on their annual turnover. And that's an aggregated turnover, so connected and affiliated entities of the business. So for smaller businesses with an aggregated turnover of less than 20 million Australian dollars, you get a corporate tax rate of 25% plus your fixed R&D premium of 18.5, which is probably that magic number of 43.5% that a lot of businesses are used to hearing. So for larger businesses, we have what's similar to your personal tax, where you actually have a scaling rate that adjusts depending on your income. You have what's called an R&D intensity. So the corporate tax rate is either 25 or 30 for these larger businesses, and the R&D intensity ranges from 8.5% for your first 2% of intensity, and a 16.5% benefit for if companies are spending more than 2% of the OPEX of the business on R&D. So that part is a little bit complex, but it's designed so that larger businesses that are conducting a larger proportion of R&D get a significant benefit compared to, say, a large business doing a little bit of R&D on the side. We'll go to the next slide, please. So there are three main criteria of eligibility for the R&D tax offset. One, you need to be an eligible entity. So you need to be a company incorporated within Australia, or incorporated in a foreign state with a tax treaty with Australia, but to avoid complexity, Australian companies. And trusts are not eligible. So where you have a tax structure that's more beneficial for, say, like a trust, it's unlikely that you'll qualify for the R&D tax incentive. You also need to be conducting R&D activities for yourself rather than for other entities. There's some rules around that too. There's going to be a lot of asterisks on a lot of these comments, but for the general information here, you need to be conducting the activities for yourself. Eligible activities is probably the most important section. So not all types of activities that businesses conduct are eligible for the R&D tax incentive. There is two that are specifically identified, which are core and supporting activities. So core activities are experimental, hypothesis-driven activities, whereas supporting activities are directly related to those. So, for example, it might be background research, or perhaps setting up a particular apparatus to conduct an experiment, for example. And functionally, all of these things need to be conducted in Australia. So you do have very specific and very limited rules for when you can apply for the R&D tax incentive on overseas activities and expenditures. And lastly, we have eligible expenditure. So you need to spend at least an amount of $20,000 to qualify during an income period and submit your application. So if you're under that $20,000 limit, you may not qualify, or you will not qualify unless you're incurring those expenses to an RSP, a registered service provider. And you need to make sure that you're keeping appropriate records that justify how the expenses that you're incurring relate to the R&D activities that you're registering. So we'll jump to the next page or the next slide here, and just a little bit of detail here about the eligible R&D activities. So core R&D activities are legislated, and so there's a particular section of the Income Tax Assessment Act that we get this information from, and it's industry agnostic. So this same set of rules applies to all the different R&D activities across all the different industries out there, and there's three main requirements. So you need to have activities whose outcomes cannot be known or determined in advance based on current knowledge, information, or experience. They must involve a systematic progression of work based on principles of established science. So a hypothesis proceeding through an experiment to test the hypothesis, generate results that you can observe and evaluate, and lead to the drawing of conclusions that either validate or invalidate your hypothesis. The scientific method, essentially. And you also need to have a purpose of generating new knowledge. And so that means that you're not accidentally conducting R&D. You identified there's a particular project and a particular theory that you want to test, and that is your core activity to pursue that until you've validated that theory, hopefully. Then we have supporting activities. And as mentioned before, there is going to be a bunch of different activities within a business that you're going to need to conduct in order to further that R&D core that you're working on. So these might be things that are directly related to the conduct before, during, or after the R&D activity. We've got some examples there of literature reviews, equipment maintenance, or post-experiment evaluations. Perhaps it could be bringing in an external consultant to give you some information on the results and how they can be interpreted. There's a couple of rules there. Similarly, if you are in an environment where you're also producing goods or services, so there might be some revenue associated or overlapping with your R&D activities, then you've also got an additional test called the dominant purpose test. And that's to make sure that these supporting activities, the dominant purpose of you conducting them is your R&D, rather than, say, some manufacturing or commercial objective.
Next slide. Yep.
Now, on eligible expenditure, you're entitled to a notional deduction for eligible expenditure you incur on the R&D activities that you register during the income period. So as Renee mentioned earlier, it's an annual application process. And so you describe the progress of your R&D activities as well as the expenditures incurred on those activities. You can't claim a notional deduction for expenditures that don't have a direct nexus to your R&D. And so it's important then that operating expenses or marketing expenditure, for example, is excluded from your claims. And some quick examples of those types of expenditures which we commonly see. You've got staff costs associated with actually contributing to and driving the conduct of your R&D activities. You might have contract expenditure with some related parties who have been consulting or contracted to do work on your behalf. You might also have overheads that you've incurred in the course of conducting these activities. Common ones would be utilities or rent as an example. And then you might have some direct costs that might be involved with, say, purchasing machinery or consumables, or perhaps subscriptions to software applications that you use during the conduct of your R&D. Next slide, please. So governance is an important theme that we always talk about, because the regulators are constantly making sure that the scheme is being taken or it's being contributed to appropriately, and that the actual work that is eligible R&D is different from those that are just sort of not conducting R&D. It's important that businesses keep appropriate records to substantiate that what they are doing meets all of the eligibility criteria. So as with all things like your company tax return, you need to make sure that you're keeping appropriate documentation. One major one that we always talk about, for example, is evidencing the time that your staff are contributing to these activities. So timesheets are the golden goose of record keeping, because it allows you to draw a direct nexus between who is contributing, how they're contributing, and along that way, preparing documents and evidence that can be used to prepare and support your application. Next slide, please. Now, here's a bit of an example, because it helps to bring it into perspective here. We've got a company, Green Energy Solutions. They're a small to medium enterprise advancing renewable energy technologies. And they've got a primary objective that they've identified within the market because of a new material that they've discovered or believe can be applied to the development of photovoltaics. And so what they've done is they've conducted some background research to identify the current state of the art, as well as some patent searches to determine if what they're pursuing is truly novel. And then at that point in time, once they've understood that there isn't an existing, solution out there that applies their theories, they've developed a hypothesis. And so this is going to talk about their potential improvements that they believe they can achieve. And it sets the stage for what that experimental process is that they can conduct to validate or invalidate whether their hypothesis is true. So through that process of experimentation, they conduct a series of experiments. Maybe they partner with a university to actually conduct or perhaps contribute to the activities. They generate data and results which are analysed, which ultimately feeds back into that process of either validating or invalidating their hypothesis. You could perhaps see an example of, once this photovoltaic composite has been developed, that there might be a new activity which starts of how perhaps they reach this second objective of, can a local manufacturing process be established that can produce these solar panels? And you could see how a project, the development of a novel photovoltaic, might end up with multiple activities that grow and extend on top of each other. And we'll go to the next slide now. Rather than sort of a very specific example, it might also help to understand how you can identify different types of potentially eligible R&D activities within different industries. And so with manufacturing, for example, we've seen a lot of adoption of Internet of Things and AI for lots of different factories and operations to improve productivity, or perhaps to improve the quality of goods that are manufactured. So triggers might be identifying whether AI algorithms are being implemented into the business, or perhaps whether there's a new production process or material that's been introduced. In agriculture, we've seen lots of work with robotics, as well as satellite imagery, and the data that is allowing to drive decisions for these businesses to improve agricultural outcomes as well as production outcomes. And then in the energy sector, you might have, for example, innovations in the transportation and the storage of different energies, as well as perhaps a lot of smart grid technologies of how we're actually managing and distributing the energy across the grid. So there's a million different ways you can identify eligible R&D, and really it all comes back to that main legislative criteria. Are there unknown outcomes that cannot be predicted? And are you as a business identifying a potential new solution or process or technology that you'd like to put some effort towards developing and hopefully turning into a lucrative opportunity for you as a business? So we'll go to the next slide now as well. And this is probably pretty important, linking back with grants. Maybe you want to take over here, Renee?
Yeah, look, and I think to my point before, the R&D tax incentive is probably the most readily sort of used program. There are other grants out there, and I think one benefit and one differentiating feature between the R&D tax incentive and other grants is that it's a self-assessment process. So I've just got sort of a few bubbles here where we're sort of identifying differences between the tax incentive and grants, and that's probably the biggest difference, is that grants are competitive. Grants tend to focus in on strategic and national priority areas of the government as well, so they can be very targeted to certain industries, whereas the R&D tax incentive, it's industry agnostic. It is available to everybody that self-assesses their activities as eligible, as long as we sort of bring in that governance around that to support what you're doing and evidencing that. So that's just giving you a bit of a flavour. So we might move to the next slide, because the Australian grants landscape is extensive and can be a bit complex to navigate, with in excess of over sort of $80 billion in grant funding available kind of at any one point in time. Obviously, grant programs open and close, but I think one of the government websites sort of talks around about 4,000 programs. So it can be daunting. As I said before, unlike the R&D tax incentive, they generally are competitive. Application requirements can require a substantial level of effort, and generally funding pools can get exhausted quite quickly. So before launching into sort of, I suppose, investigating and preparing a grant application, it's really important that you consider some of the key criteria before sort of launching in, because it can take a fair bit of time, particularly as that sort of level of funding increases that you're looking for. So one of the first things that we've got here is really consider the eligible applicant criteria. Each grant program has unique requirements around the eligibility of the entity. Some will allow trusts, some won't. They often want to identify where the IP is being held. Again, location of headquarters. Often regional grant programs will want to have the headquarters based in a certain state, particularly if they're a state grant. They'll want to know that entity is located in that state. So that's really something to sort of consider before you sort of launch in and start filling in these applications, because you really don't want to fail at that first hurdle. The second thing to really sort of be comfortable with is the grant criteria, the grant sort of selection criteria, and what is an eligible project for that grant. As I said, they are competitive, a lot of these programs, and it's really important that your project aligns with the grant strategic objectives in terms of what they're trying to incentivize. So really getting across that grant criteria before sort of launching in. It's really hard to redefine and rescope a project for a grant application specifically. So getting on the front foot also in knowing what grant programs are coming up or looking to open soon really helps with that sort of project planning. I mentioned before that the application process in itself can be quite extensive. Quite often, on some of the larger grant programs, companies are required to sort of send through with the grant application supporting documentation. So it's really important that you get on the front foot with your project plans, whether that be business plans. Often they'll ask for risk management plans and any sort of sales and revenue sort of budgets and allocations. So that's something just to be aware of. These are things that we kind of have to have ready when you're submitting an application. And as mentioned before, grants are competitive, but they often require companies to have match funding for that project. So again, when you are putting an application forward, one of the criteria is demonstrating how you can actually fund your portion of that program. So getting a clear sort of strategy around, how you are looking to sort of fund your component of a grant application is critical. And just a note there too is that clawback applies to grant expenditure where you've actually picked that up for an R&D tax incentive claim. So our team kind of work with companies as well in terms of setting up your projects to ensure that we're sort of giving you the best opportunities under a grant program as well as the R&D tax incentives. So they're just things I think to be conscious of when looking to explore grant opportunities. Look, I could go on and on in terms of the types of grants that are available. As I said, it's very extensive, but I'm just conscious of time, and I know we've probably gone over, but really, in conclusion, innovation is obviously a key to any successful transformation project. And really getting on the front foot, identifying the government funding opportunities that are available to you and planning for those will really be critical and should form part of your strategy. So thank you everyone for your time. Happy to sort of take on any questions, just aware that we're probably tuned into a bit more than we thought.
Hopefully we answered all.
Yeah, Alex, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Look, we have got a few questions. So I'll start off with a question from the floor. What are the common challenges you've identified that SMEs face when applying for R&D tax incentives and grants, and how can they overcome these obstacles?
Yeah, so I think to Alex's point, R&D governance and substantiation is critical now under R&D tax incentive and grant programs. So I think SMEs struggle with that sort of documentary evidence trail, but there are ways that you can sort of capture that information in sort of a lean way to sort of meet that criteria around the substantiation effort required to support your claim.
Particularly in this sort of AI world now where you've got large language models that can produce content almost instantaneously, there's a bigger focus from the regulators on making sure that documentation is contemporaneous and it's not something that's pulled together after the fact. So it's about being proactive and putting in place good processes that can actually document and record these activities.
Yeah, great. Good answer. There's another question from Helen. What delineates a commercial versus non-commercial goal for the purpose of the eligibility criteria?
Yeah, I think that the purpose test is something that Alex sort of spoke about. And really, we've got to demonstrate that the purpose of those activities is actually to generate new knowledge. And that's new technical knowledge. So you can actually have an activity that has a dual purpose, but it's really being able to sort of, support why a dominant purpose of that is to produce new knowledge and technical know-how for the organisation. So that is key in terms of delineating between sort of a pure commercial objective and an R&D objective.
And similarly, the intention of the R&D tax incentive is to support and encourage businesses to do activities they wouldn't normally otherwise undertake because of uncertain commercial outcomes. And so if you've got a certain commercial outcome, it's probably unlikely that you're going to meet those criteria within the incentive. So that's sometimes a good way to identify is this proven yet, or have I actually got a commercial outcome that I'm currently available to exploit?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. There's two more questions, guys. So can two or more small businesses team up for the R&D tax incentive by sharing the investment of $20,000?
Yeah, unfortunately, no, it goes on an entity basis. So you'd have to sort of lodge a claim each if you were but you'd have to sort of make sure that threshold was above the 20K.
Awesome. Okay. And last but not least, what do you see as the most accessible R&D incentives and grants available to SMEs? How do you see the...
You've got to start with R&D incentives.
The R&D tax incentive.
It's non-competitive, and if you qualify, you are entitled to it. And so that's definitely where we would start. outside of that, if your technology readiness of whatever it is that you're developed is progressed further than that sort of unknown stage and experimental stage, maybe that's where grants step in and actually provide you with an opportunity to fund that next stage in the journey.
Yeah, the industry growth program is one that really sort of helps. It's the old accelerated commercialisation. So that's one I think that a lot of SMEs have sort of historically used in the past. But again, there's a lot of industry specific grants. So if you're in the renewable space, you'll find probably that there'll be a lot more sort of opportunities to tap into to government funding in that regard.
Or if you're a female founder, there's grants for those types of businesses as well. Or if you've got a particular social cause, generally that might also provide a good justification or a particular program to support that as well. So assessing who you are as a business and what you represent is a good way to identify potential grants.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Renee and Alex. That has been very informative. And I think that we'll probably get a few more questions after the fact. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing all that information.
Thanks. And we'll be around in the booth as well if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, come ask more questions.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, everyone, it is now time to take a short break, and we are going to be preparing for our next session with Morgan Ferrier, who's the General Manager of Memberships with the AIIA, and which will begin at 3:30 p.m. So don't forget that you can go and access the booths and resources for a further chat with our sponsors and our supporters today. Cyber Wardens are here to support you with any questions and resources around protecting your small business from cyber threats. And don't forget to put yourself in the running for your free premium subscription by submitting a testimonial to ICN. That can be a video or a written testimonial. So don't forget to put your thoughts together and send that through, because we're going to pick the best one for a free premium subscription. So we look forward to seeing you back online at 3:30, where we'll be joined by Morgan Ferrier. Thank you.